The day dawned cold and gray on the busy streets of New York City. Amid the rush of passers-by and the incessant noise of car horns, a young woman stood out on the sidewalk. She wore simple clothes, a coat already worn by time, and held a small basket of homemade sweets. Her eyes carried a mix of tiredness and hope, and her advanced pregnancy made it impossible to ignore her condition. She tried to sell her products with a shy smile, but the indifference of the people around her was relentless. Many averted their gaze, quickening their steps as if her presence were invisible. The young woman's life was not easy. With scarce resources, each day was a battle to earn enough money to eat and pay for makeshift shelter. Her thoughts were too occupied with worries to notice that among the crowd, someone had stopped to observe her. Across the street, Caroline Leavitt, one of the most influential women of the moment, walked with her security and aides. Always attentive to her commitments, her routine was marked by interviews, important events, and political debates. But at that moment, something made her lose focus, her eyes fixed on the pregnant young woman. There was something in that woman's expression that made her hesitate. Caroline stopped. What she saw was much more than a street vendor. She saw a mother fighting for her survival and for her child's future. It was a look that carried immense weight, something words could not express. Caroline's team noticed her sudden pause. The security guards looked in her direction, expecting her to move on, but she did not budge. Instead, she took a deep breath and walked toward the young woman. The people around began to realize what was happening. Whispers spread. It was not common to see a public figure stop like that in the middle of the street to talk to a stranger, but Caroline seemed unconcerned with the stares. Her focus was entirely on that woman. When she finally stood before her, the vendor hesitated, unsure whether to offer her sweets or simply wait for Caroline to speak. Her eyes, now wide, mixed surprise and confusion. Why would such a powerful and influential woman be interested in someone like her? What happened next made everyone around stop to watch. An unexpected gesture that would change not only the life of the young vendor, but also deeply touch the hearts of all who witnessed that moment. The young vendor's name was Isabella Martins. At just 22 years old, she faced challenges that seemed much larger than herself. Her pregnancy was unplanned, and after the child's father disappeared without a trace, Isabella found herself completely alone. With no family nearby and no stable job, she was forced to find a way to support herself. The street became her workplace. Every morning, she prepared simple sweets in a small rented room and went out to sell them at the busiest corners of the city. The money she earned barely covered her rent, and the difficulties only increased as her belly grew. Her body was tired, her feet swollen from walking all day, but she could not afford to rest. Frustration was a constant companion. Isabella wondered every day if she would be able to provide a decent life for the child about to be born, and the answer never seemed clear. Her greatest fear was ending up on the streets without a roof to protect her baby. The city of New York, with all its shine and wealth, seemed indifferent to the suffering of people like her. The tall buildings and luxurious storefronts contrasted with her reality. While some spent small fortunes on expensive dinners, she struggled to secure a basic meal. But Isabella never stopped dreaming. Despite the hardships, she believed that something good could happen. She just didn't know how or when. On that particular day, sales were poor. The cold kept people off the street, and her sweets remained untouched in the basket. Isabella tried to stay upbeat, but hunger and fatigue began to take over. Her stomach growled, and her hands trembled slightly from the chill. It was then that she noticed the unusual movement around her. People began to whisper and look in her direction. For a moment, Isabella thought she might be doing something wrong, but quickly realized it was not about her. It was about the woman approaching. She recognized the face immediately, Caroline Leavitt, a figure she had seen on television and social media. A powerful woman, influential and admired by millions. But why would someone like her stop right there, in front of a simple street vendor? Isabella's heart raced. Her first impulse was to look down, unsure how to react. But Caroline did not seem intimidated by the situation. On the contrary, her eyes showed genuine interest. Gradually, the buzz around them grew. People took out their phones to record the moment, curious to see what would happen next. Caroline Leavitt was not just an influential woman. She was known for her striking presence, sharp intelligence, and above all, her ability to connect with people. But that afternoon, in the middle of a busy street in New York, she was not accompanied by aides or participating in important events. She was there, standing still, looking directly into the eyes of a young pregnant woman trying to sell sweets to survive. There was something about Isabella that made Caroline stop. Perhaps it was the tired expression, or the way she held the basket as if that small business was her last hope. As she observed the young woman, a whirlwind of thoughts passed through her mind. How could a pregnant woman be working out on the street like that? Where was the help? Where was the family? Caroline's security guards, always alert, looked around, waiting for her to move on. But she didn't budge. Instead, she stepped forward, ignoring the cold and the curious gazes around her. "Hello," she said, in a gentle but firm tone. Isabella took a moment to respond. The shock of seeing such a famous woman right in front of her made her mind freeze for a few seconds. She blinked a few times, making sure this was really happening. "Ha ha ha," she replied, her voice a bit shaky. Caroline looked at the basket of sweets. She picked one up and held it for a few moments, as if she were analyzing it. "Do you make these yourself?" she asked. Isabella nodded quickly. "Yes, I make them at home. I try to sell them to make some money." The honesty of her response made Caroline feel a tightness in her chest. For a moment, she recalled her own childhood. Her family hadn't always had everything handed to them. She knew what it was like to struggle for a better future. The buzz around them grew louder. People were pulling out their phones, recording every detail. It wasn't every day that a celebrity stopped in the middle of the street to talk to a street vendor. Then, something unexpected happened. Instead of just buying a sweet and moving on, Caroline did something no one imagined. She took her purse and pulled out a significant amount of cash. Calmly, she placed the bills in Isabella's basket, saying nothing at first. Isabella's eyes widened. Her heart raced. This couldn't be real. This is a lot of money, she said, not knowing how to react. Caroline smiled. "I want you to stop selling for today and go rest. You shouldn't be here in this situation." The young woman felt her eyes welling up with tears. No one had ever done something like this for her. Caroline's gesture was more than just a simple act of charity. It was a recognition of her struggle, proof that someone saw her effort and her pain. The people around them began to applaud. Some, emotional, discreetly wiped away their tears. What was supposed to be just another difficult day in Isabella's life turned into a moment she would never forget. But Caroline didn't stop there. Something even greater was about to happen. Isabella held the bills with trembling hands. The cold breeze of New York cut against her skin, but at that moment, her body felt numb. What had just happened was surreal. Just a few minutes ago, she didn't know if she would sell enough sweets to eat that night, and now she held an amount that could change her fate. But instead of celebrating, she felt a knot in her throat. The weight of reality hit her like a blow. She hesitated. This didn't feel right. Should she accept? What if it was just a momentary gesture? Did Caroline really care, or was she just trying to improve her image? Caroline noticed the hesitation in the young woman's eyes and took a step closer. Her imposing yet warm presence made everyone around feel that something grand was about to happen. "You look worried," Caroline said, her voice filled with empathy. Isabella took a deep breath, trying to find words. I don't know if I should accept. This is a lot of money." Her voice faltered, and she pressed the basket against her chest as if she needed something to hold on to. Caroline smiled slightly. "This money won't change my life," she replied sincerely, "but it can change yours." The words were spoken with such naturalness that Isabella felt a tightness in her chest. How many times in the last few months had she wished someone would see her? How many nights had she slept crying, wondering if her child would have a worthy future? The people around watched the scene in silence. Every detail, every expression, every movement was captured by phones and broadcast to thousands of people in real time. This encounter was about to become one of the most moving moments the city had ever witnessed. Isabella quickly wiped away a tear and finally looked directly into Caroline's eyes. "Why are you doing this?" Caroline sighed and glanced briefly at the ground before responding. "Because a few years ago, I met someone like you, a strong woman, fighting alone, trying to survive, and no one helped her. I regret not doing anything for her, but today, I can do something for you." Isabella felt her legs weaken. Those words carried a weight she didn't expect. It wasn't just charity. It wasn't just a good deed for the cameras. Caroline truly understood her pain, but what happened next made everyone around hold their breath. Caroline turned to her team, who were watching the scene with serious expressions, and gave a clear order. "I want you to find a place for this young woman to stay, and a job too." The silence was instantaneous. Everyone seemed to be processing what had just been said. Isabella's eyes widened, unable to comprehend. What?" Her voice came out almost in a whisper. Caroline nodded, her gaze determined. "You need a future. Money can help for a day, but stability changes lives." The words echoed in Isabella's heart. She felt a wave of emotion wash over her body. Her knees buckled and she held onto her belly as if her baby could feel what was happening. The tears that were once timid now flowed uncontrollably. "Is this real?" she whispered, still unable to believe it. Caroline leaned down slightly to be at her level. "Yes, you don't have to fight alone anymore." The people around them began to clap, some even wiping away tears. What had started as just another difficult day for Isabella was now becoming the beginning of a new chapter in her life. As Caroline's security team called contacts to organize everything, Isabella was overwhelmed by a wave of gratitude. For the first time in a long time, she felt hope. While Isabella tried to process Caroline's unexpected generosity, a new kind of tension began to grow in the air. The applause and murmurs echoing down the street were interrupted by a voice filled with skepticism. "This doesn't seem fair," said a thin man, with a suspicious look and crossed arms. The dry tone of his statement caused some people around to stop clapping and look in his direction. He was Ricardo, a coffee vendor who had worked in the same area for years. He had a small cart where he sold hot drinks to the hurried New Yorkers passing by. Unlike Isabella, he already had a loyal clientele, but what had just happened deeply unsettled him. "What exactly doesn't seem fair?" asked Caroline, crossing her arms and staring at Ricardo with an analytical look. The man huffed and pointed at Isabella. "I'm here every day, rain or shine, working non-stop to support my family. No one has ever stopped to give me money like that, let alone a guaranteed job. But then this girl shows up, sells some sweets, and suddenly her life changes." Isabella lowered her head, feeling a lump in her throat. The last thing she wanted was to cause resentment. Until recently, no one had even glanced her way. Now, she felt she needed to justify her own existence. Caroline noticed the young woman's discomfort and stepped forward, turning her full attention to Ricardo. "You have an established business, even if it's small. You built something with your own hands, and even with difficulties, you managed to stay afloat. But what about her? What does she have?" Ricardo opened his mouth to respond, but hesitated. The truth was, he had never thought about that. "She's pregnant," Carolina continued, with a more emphatic tone. "Alone, without family, without support, without anyone. Have you ever tried to imagine the despair of someone carrying a child in their womb without knowing where they will sleep the next night?" The looks around became even more attentive. Some spectators who had previously seemed neutral were now looking at Isabella with more empathy. Ricardo, however, was not convinced. "And what about me? What about all the other workers here? Do you think just because we have a selling point our lives are easy?" Caroline nodded slightly, understanding the frustration behind the man's words. I'm not saying your life is easy, Ricardo, but helping one person doesn't mean I'm ignoring the struggles of others. The truth is, the world needs more compassion. Today, I can help Isabella. Tomorrow, it might be someone else. That doesn't diminish anyone's effort. The silence that followed was heavy. Ricardo looked away, seeming to reflect on that. Isabella, who had remained silent until then, felt the need to speak. She turned to Ricardo, holding the basket of sweets against her chest. I never wanted it to be this way. Her voice was trembling. I didn't ask Caroline to stop. I didn't ask for this money. I just wanted to sell my sweets to make sure my child has something to eat when he is born. Ricardo's eyes sparkled for a moment, as if a piece of his resistance had broken. He looked at Isabella's belly and let out a long sigh. "And where do you live?" he asked, his voice quieter. Isabella hesitated. "I rent a small room, but I'm already behind on the rent. If I can't get enough money by the end of the month, I'll have to leave." The answer fell like a stone on Ricardo's conscience. He, who passed by her daily, had never stopped to ask anything. He had never cared to know who that young woman was, or why she was there. Caroline noticed the change in the man's expression and decided to soften her tone. "What do you think about helping too?" she asked with a small smile. Ricardo raised his eyebrows. "Help how? You already sell coffee, right? How about putting her sweets for sale too? It could be a partnership. You help someone in need and, who knows, maybe even increase your sales." The man blinked a few times, clearly caught off guard. He hadn't expected that proposal. He looked at Isabella's basket, then at her, and finally at Caroline. His silence made everyone hold their breath. Then, to everyone's surprise, he let out a short laugh. "Well, I've always wanted to offer something to go with the coffee." Isabella's eyes widened, unable to believe what she had just heard. "Really? We can try. If the customers like it, we continue." The spectators, who had been closely following everything, began to applaud again. What had once seemed a confrontation was now transforming into a moment of unity. Isabella brought her hands to her face, holding back tears. It was as if, for the first time in a long time, fate was on her side. Carolina smiled, satisfied. "See, when we help someone, we end up creating more opportunities than we imagine." Ricardo scratched his head, still processing the idea. "Well, I hope these sweets are good," he joked. Isabella laughed, still emotional. "I guarantee they are." Caroline took one last look at the crowd around. This is what happens when we choose compassion over judgment. Small gestures can change lives. Applauded again, Caroline looked at Isabella and gave a slight nod. "Now, let's make sure you have a home and a future." And so, what started as a simple encounter on the street transformed into a wave of solidarity that would forever change Isabella's life. The applause, echoing down the street, began to fade, but the emotion on Isabella's face remained intense. Her mind tried to process everything that had happened in a matter of minutes. For the first time in a long time, she felt she was no longer fighting alone. Caroline Leavitt looked around, observing the crowd that still stared at her, absorbing the impact of what they had just witnessed. The encounter between her and the young pregnant woman hadn't been planned, but now it seemed that something much bigger was happening there. "Do you have someone who can help you? Any family or close friends?" Carolina asked, with a careful look. Isabella lowered her gaze for a moment, as if the question had awakened painful memories. "No," she said quietly. "I came to New York a few months ago trying to start over, but when I found out about the pregnancy, everything became even harder." Caroline nodded slightly, understanding the depth of that response. "Then now you have me," she said in a firm yet gentle tone. Isabella's eyes filled with tears again. No one had ever said something like that to her. The simple fact of being recognized, of knowing that someone cared, was something that completely changed her world. Caroline's team began to act quickly. One of her aides stepped away to make calls, while others took notes. They were organizing a safe place for Isabella to spend the night and planning how to help her in a more lasting way. Meanwhile, Ricardo, the coffee vendor who had initially questioned the help offered to Isabella, continued to observe the scene. Skepticism was still present in his gaze, but now there was something more, a silent reflection. He looked at his coffee stand, then at Isabella's basket of sweets, and sighed. "So, do you make these sweets every day?" he asked, trying to hide a tone of curiosity. Isabella looked at him, a bit hesitant. "Yes, I wake up early to prepare them before I go out to sell." Ricardo nodded and scratched his chin. "If you want, I can sell some at my stand. My customers always ask for something sweet to go with their coffee." Isabella's eyes widened, surprised by the offer. "Are you serious? It doesn't hurt to try. If they sell well, we can keep going." The smile that formed on Isabella's face was instant. That would be amazing. The crowd around them, which was still watching the scene, began to applaud again. The twist in the story was happening before everyone's eyes. Caroline looked at Ricardo with a half smile. "See, small gestures create opportunities we never imagine." Ricardo rolled his eyes slightly, but couldn't hide a discreet smile. "Well, I just hope these sweets are good." Isabella laughed, wiping the tears still streaming down her face. "I promise they are." That night, Isabella didn't have to worry about where she would sleep. Caroline made sure she was taken to a comfortable shelter for pregnant women, where she would receive support until she found permanent housing. As she lay down in that warm, soft bed, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: security. She gently placed her hand on her belly, feeling the small movements of her baby. "We did it," she whispered, letting the tears flow with happiness. For the first time, she believed that her life could change. In the following days, the video of the encounter between Caroline and Isabella went viral. Millions of people shared the footage, moved by how a simple act of kindness could transform a life. Newspapers, television channels, and influencers commented on the case. Isabella's name began to be recognized, and to her surprise, several people started reaching out wanting to help her. But the most significant change was at Ricardo's small coffee stand. The simple act of including Isabella's sweets on the menu doubled the business. People from all over the city came to try the sweets while simultaneously supporting the young mother. The business, which had once been just a means of survival, transformed into something much bigger. Now, Isabella was not only selling her sweets, but also starting to plan something bigger, opening her own bakery. And once again, Caroline was there to support her. Months later, at a charity event, Caroline was invited to speak about the impact of small actions on people's lives. When she stepped on stage, she looked at the audience and took a deep breath before starting. Some people believe that to change the world, we need grand gestures. But in reality, what transforms lives are small acts of compassion at the right moment. The auditorium was in absolute silence, attentive to every word. "I met Isabella on an ordinary day, on some street in New York. She didn't ask me for help. She was just there, struggling to survive. But I stopped, I saw her, and in that moment I realized I could do something." She paused briefly, observing the emotional expressions of the audience. What happened next? That seemingly small gesture triggered a change that no one could foresee. Today, Isabella is starting over with her life, and more than that, she is inspiring others to never give up. The audience erupted in applause. Caroline smiled and concluded, "May we always remember, helping one person does not mean ignoring the struggles of others. It means creating a world where no one has to face life alone." At the end of that night, while Isabella worked in the small space she had managed to rent to produce her sweets, she felt a small contraction. Her baby was about to be born. She smiled, holding her belly, and knew that all of this had happened for a reason. This was not just the story of an unexpected encounter. It was proof that empathy and generosity still existed and could transform lives.